Hi, everyone. My name is Debbie from NDIS Property Australia. Welcome to our next webinar on SDA Tenancy Mixes. I've got Minh and Denise with me today. Denise is going to be in the background answering questions, helping out, and Minh and I will be presenting today. So I will just share my screen before anything else. Okay, I hope everyone can see that fine. All right, so yeah, we're talking about SDA tenancy mixes today and all of the implications that has around essentially the income you're going to be potentially getting from your property. But firstly, just a little disclaimer. This is not financial advice. Any objectives, financial situation or needs you have, you should get independent advice before progressing on any NDIS property development or investment. We are recording this webinar, so everyone who has signed up today, registered, whether you managed to jump on board or not, will get a copy of the recording along with the slides. If you do have a question, just pop it in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of the screen anytime. We will endeavour to answer as many questions as we can during the presentation. If not, then we will definitely get around to answering them at the end. So I think that is all I need to talk about there. Just a little bit about NDIS Property Australia, if you're not familiar with who we are. We are a Brisbane-based advisory and consulting firm specialising in SDA, Specialist Disability Accommodation. So we have a team of researchers, which is why we like to share our knowledge in webinars. We do a lot of data crunching, number crunching, which is really important when it comes to understanding the feasibility of your potential investment. We also have the SDA Housing podcast and over 300 episodes, 76,000 downloads. So if you haven't come across that yet, please do. And there'll be a link at the end of the presentation to find that online. So moving straight into it, I might get Minh to discuss the SDA process.
Oh, me? This is a very big topic, Debbie.
Just touch on it.
Okay, the only thing relevant to this this webinar today really is where are we? Betting provider research.
Research, buying process.
Buying process. Well, this is about tenancy mixes today. So if
Mm.
you go to the buying process, there's the three pink boxes there. First one, second one, the third pink box is
Yeah.
the tenancy mix there, and the very far right pink box there. So the tenancy mix outcome really is an important part that everyone is going to try and figure out. Well, what do I get for my returns, for my investment? How will the participants mix together in a 3 or 4 bedroom house with one carer there? Debbie, how in depth should I talk about this, given this very big flowchart in front of us here?
I just wanted to include that so that you realize this is just a very small part of the overall process. If you're looking at investing in SDA, it's just one of the things to consider. But it is an important thing to consider because you need to know what your likely return is going to be.
At the end of the day, every investor is going to want to know, what will I get for my investment? Well, the return on investment is based upon the tenants in the house. And the tenants in the house depends upon the tenancy mix. And the mix, as we'll discover today in today's webinar, is going to be very, what's the word?
Varied.
Varied, yeah, depending on lots of circumstances. So let's move on to the next slides and go from there, Debbie. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously this is just an overview of the different types of dwelling types that an SDA property can be. Group homes over there on the right, we're not going to talk about them because the recommendations are for group homes to be phased out. Whilst there are still a few coming onto the market, we would never recommend anyone to go with that dwelling type. We do see the majority of properties in the market are houses, probably followed thereafter by apartments and villas. So a villa, duplex, townhouse, that is considered one dwelling type for the purposes of enrolment and funding. Houses and apartment are different. So we're essentially talking about 3 different dwelling types, and those each can have different numbers of residents in those properties. Obviously, house 2 or 3 residents, villas can have 1, 2 or 3, apartments can have 1 or 2. So we just wanted to show some data that thank you very much to Barwon Investments. They put out these really good insights. Minh, do you want to quickly talk us through this snapshot?
Well, the key thing here, I think there's 2 or 3 points on a raise here, is that the number of participants that have been approved, are they here?
Yep.
24,000.
24,761.
They've been pretty much consistent the last 3 years. There hasn't been much movement in terms of the increase of numbers of SDA participants.
Very
No.
small growth, yeah.
But what has been stronger growth has been this pipeline and the deployment of actual finished enrolled dwelling to the marketplace. Where do we have here? All SDA places supply, 22,
So
23,
13,000
24.
enrolled places or bedrooms, and even more, 15,500 are in the pipeline. So essentially, we've got a massive amount of properties coming to market or already in the market that is more than needed for the current demand. And this is why it's really important to understand so much about the research that goes into the demand, supply and demand.
And there'll be a separate topic as well, I guess, one day. Moving on.
So yeah, well, this is really the first thing that touches on that. And we've been talking about this a lot over the last year or so. We created a simple, easy to remember acronym, DDD, the 3 Ds. And essentially, this is what it is: the data, the design, and the desirability of your property. So data talks about market demand, the investment returns, whether there's going to be an oversupply in the area, if there already is, what the demand for specific participants is in the area, for specific housing in the area is. All that is so important to understand. Then comes the design. Now, there's NDIS standards, and then there's good design. NDIS standards are the bare basic that must be met to make a property compliant. They're well acknowledged. They're by no means really good design. Good design takes it way above that to provide really good accessibility, future-proofing, a real focus on quality of life and sustainability of the property. And that is going to end up with a higher tenant satisfaction and hopefully long-term tenants. Desirability is really about the overall picture, the location that the property is in, your amenities, the experience the tenant, not just the tenant, but the providers are going to have in the property. What you really need to realize is that it is the tenant's home, of course. It's also the workplace for the care team that are looking after the tenants in the property. And it's got to be workable for them as well. It's got to be desirable. It's got to be in a location that they can travel to work. So there's a lot that goes into these 3 concepts of making an SDA property workable. Did you want to add anything to that, Minh?
No, it's pretty straightforward there. Yeah, all good. Moving on.
All right. So now we get into the nitty-gritty of the different types of participants. So 4 design types. I'm sure that you've all come across these, heard these before. This is just a very quick overview. High physical support, which is the highest funding category, we could say, for people with significant physical impairments and high care needs. Often they might be, generally they're going to be in a wheelchair, often don't have the ability to really do a lot independently. So they need things like a lot of automation in the home, provision for hoists, battery backup if they have equipment that needs to be powered to keep them alive. Fully accessible is going to be very similar in terms of the spatial requirements of the home, the size of the rooms, the hallways, the doorways, but more for people who may still have significant mobility impairments, but probably have a bit more independence in their daily life. Improved livability is for people who've got more cognitive impairments or sensory impairments. So the homes look very much more similar to a regular property, that they just have more maybe open spaces, better lines of sight, luminous contrasts, door handles, light switches that are much more easier for people to recognize and know where they are. Robust is more of a standalone category for people who've got more complex behaviors that may cause harm to themselves or to property or to others, or just have other conditions that maybe they need a property that is more soundproofed to minimize triggers of behaviors, essentially. Now, that's the different categories, but participants are going to get funding, their SDA funding approved on the basis of whether they're going to live on their own or share with others. And for this whole webinar, as I mentioned, we're not talking about group homes, which is for 4 or 5 tenants in a dwelling. We're just going to concentrate on the others. So a participant may be funded to live on their own, and that would be in an apartment or in a villa. They may be funded to share with one other, so 1 to 2. That could be in any of the types of dwellings that we're discussing, so a house, a villa, or apartment. And 1 to 3 funding means that they are going to be funded to live with 2 others. So 3 of them in the dwelling, and that will be either a house or a villa. So that is the dwelling types explained and the categories, SDA categories explained, which is going to be really important when it comes down to understanding how the whole tenancy mixes and funding works. So just a few concepts on what SDA design, how it can affect the basically the tenancy you're going to get in the property and therefore the income. Did you want to talk through this, Minh, or did you want me to cover this?
So you go through it. That's fine.
All right. So design, demand-driven design. There's 2 of those 3Ds straight up. High physical support is probably the most commonly built dwelling type around the country, and there's a very good reason for that. You might see this, oh, there's such an oversupply of HPS. No one's building FA, no one's building IL, no one's building robust. Not a big issue in that, because higher physical support dwellings, as long as they are certified and built correctly, can also house people with FA, fully accessible, or improved livability funding. And this is why the tenancy mix is so complex. Another reason that having a high physical support dwelling can be a good thing is that you might have an improved livability funded participant or a fully accessible funded participant move in, but they might have a degenerative condition, and over time they may end up transitioning to high physical support, and they can age in place in that same home, essentially. IL is a good option because it does have the biggest number of participants with that funding type. But again, you're limited to only that one, around 40% of all participants will have IL funding, whereas 90% will have IL or FA or HPS. Future proofing. So obviously this is a very, very important thing, going way above the design standards, to have more adjustable, height adjustable equipment in kitchens, bathrooms, bedrooms, breakout rooms, extra private spaces, second living rooms, private courtyards. All of those sorts of things will provide a much more flexible design and is going to attract participants more. So smart designs as well, layouts, construction materials that are going to reduce maintenance costs, all of those can be appealing to both tenants and providers working in the home. And moving on from that, I did have another slide which seems to have vanished. So apologies. There was a couple more things we were going to talk about there. It maybe have gotten moved. Anyway, we're going to talk now about the calculator, the SDA price calculator. Wanted to quickly go through this because I don't think a lot of people really understand how this works. There is a link here which will take you straight to the NDIS website to download this. This calculator is, I think it's updated every 6 months or a few times a year when the MRRC, I'll discuss what that is updated, which is twice a year. And every 1st of July, the prices, the SDA prices are updated by CPI. Now, I'm just going to swap out of here and I'm going to share the calculator so I can run through how that actually works. Right. So this is the actual. Now, just a little note, if you do download this, it needs to be run in Excel. If you're using Google Sheets, it doesn't work. But this is the calculator. You can see there's a bunch of different tabs down the bottom here. The main one you'll be using is the calculator. This one is for Appendix H. We're going to just touch on that very quickly in a little while. The calculator here is the one you want. Now, this is going to tell you what essentially the age of the property is. If it was enrolled pre-2022, it's going to set up a different set of calculations. But for the purposes of this exercise, we'll use post-2023 new build. If you click on all of these drop downs, you get all the options. Here you can see the different dwelling types I went through before. Apartments for 1 or 2 residents, villa, duplex, townhouse for 1, 2 or 3 residents, house for 2 and 3 residents, and I'll ignore the group homes. So that will set that. Let's keep it on house 2 residents. Here is the design category. And this will give you improved livability, fully accessible, high physical support, and robust. Now, robust with breakout room is a separate category. If it is a house or a villa, and for a villa, it must be for 2 or 3 residents. If it's a single residency villa, they don't get the option of having extra funding paid for the breakout room. So we'll stick with high physical support. These are all changeable. It can be with or without OOA, which is on-site overnight assistance, which is essentially the carers. It can be with or without fire sprinklers. And this one gets a little bit more confusing. Input tax credits were or were not claimed. This is an important thing. If you've heard about the location factor for SDA funding, this is where it's selected. These are the different SA4s around Australia, Statistical Area 4. Minh, you want to say something?
The input tax credits claimed or not claimed. So if you set up a company trust structure where you actually claim the GST on the build contract, on the build costs, you can actually claim the GST part back as a investor. So that's the reason why you have that GST claimed. Now, sometimes the developer or vendor who sells it to you, they claim it themselves, which means you can't claim it, which means it does also impact upon the income as well. So that's more an accounting question that if you or the vendor did claim that GST, that's all it is, yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that, Minh. So yeah, back to the location, the SA4, as you'll see there. If you go onto the Australian Bureau of Statistics, there's actually a map you can access that you type in the address of anywhere and it will tell you what the SA4 location is. So you kind of need to know that to know what the income is going to be. If we work it out on media capital city, you see the location factor here is 1. If we change it to, okay, let's do something in Sydney, such as the eastern suburbs, you'll see it jumps up to 1.9, which is almost doubling the SDA income. But if we go to, I know, somewhere in Queensland, for example, Ipswich, it jumps down to 0.84. So it's reducing it below that median 1. So it's really important to know what the location factor is for any particular location that the property is you're looking at. But what this down here means is that you're going to get the SDA amount. So in this situation, $94,818 for 1 tenant in a 2-resident house. This is the tenant's funding. Now, there is also this amount here. MRRC. That is there's a tab here that explains it. The maximum reasonable rent contribution. Essentially, it's 25% of the disability support pension and their Commonwealth rent assistance. So that is the same for every participant in Australia, regardless of what their SDA funding is. They can be charged that amount per annum. They can't be charged more, but they could feasibly be offered a discount on the rent if the property owner was to wish to do that. But those two figures combined will give you the total income that you could expect. If the house is enrolled for 2 residents and the participants' funding is for 2 residents. Now, this is really important when we go on to discuss the tenancy mix and the lesser of rule, etc. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how this works. Do download it, play around with it. It's quite interesting. And I will touch briefly later on the Appendix H and what that is, but that actually has its own separate calculator. So did I cover everything there, Minh? Was there anything else?
No, it's pretty straightforward. Next slide will be the houses, the homes.
I will just have to go back into sharing
Mm-hmm.
the presentation.
So when you think about homes, most people think 4-bedroom house, right? So we want to show you some examples of different types of homes that are applicable for providers, SDA providers and still providers to work with in terms of delivery of care supports to a NDIS environment of accommodation. So here we have a small block of land with 3-bedroom house, which is a carer plus 2 residents there. The 4-bedroom one is carer plus 3 residents. This one can be either a downstairs and upstairs different units, unit A, unit B, or a villa, a lift in the house. Obviously, a lift allows you to have a full house of 2 or 3 tenants with a spare room, I guess. And that's the double-story house, which is pretty rare anyway. So next slide here will be showing us different types of homes. So you got the manor home, which is basically a extra large home with 3 or 4 or 5 apartments internally. The duplex home, which is a mirror image of each other on the left and right side there, split mirror image. And the dual key or dual occupancy design house is this one here, is where you might have 2 or 3 on one side and 1 on another side, right? And the villa, so I go back there, Debbie. The villa is basically 3 or 4 side by side with the carport here as an example, where an OOA on site would look after probably 3 single resident villas living by themselves. But if it was a robust house, you'd actually have an OOA in each one of those individual villas, okay? So they're the types of homes or products there. So Debbie, I'll let you to talk about these next 4 floor plans and how important it is, design being a very important aspect. So let's talk about the designs here.
Sure. So this is one that we wanted to throw in, which we thought was one of not a great design. It's a 4-bedroom, 4-bathroom house, single, double garage house. Why is this not a great design? Okay, you've got 3 participant bedrooms. You can see bed 2, bed 3. I'm not sure if my cursor is showing up there. Yeah. So bed 2 with ensuite, bed 3 with ensuite, bed 4 with ensuite. Over here is the carer's room with a smaller ensuite. Looks good. There's only 1 kitchen living room. There's no other space for the participants. You're very unlikely to get 3 tenants. You're unlikely to get 3 tenants in a house anyway in the current market at present, unless you're in a very undersupplied area. But having 3 tenants in a property like this is even less likely because they don't have their own space.
This design was done by a Gold Coast builder 5 years ago, Debbie, 4.5 years ago.
Meets requirements,
yeah,
but it's not good design.
Yeah, back in the day, everyone thought, just put in 3 or 4 HBS houses, bedrooms, and that should be fine. Assuming 3 or 4 tenants, so 3 or 4 rooms, so 3 tenants. But in hindsight here, if you were to go back back to the past, we'd redo this. You'd actually chop up bedroom 4 to maybe create a communal visitor toilet, and that space there would actually be a media room, a large
or just
media
room. a second multi-purpose room.
Yeah, or you cut that in half and actually make that a storage room, plus a NPR, plus a communal toilet. So that would be more of a spacious designed house right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Simple changes, but make a big difference because you're not going to get that third tenant anyway.
But let's be honest, with this floor plan here, we're looking at maybe we're looking at either back to be one or two tenants only,
Mm.
as it currently is constructed right now, one or two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you think about a tenant wanting to or not wanting to share with another person, a lot of participants will say, no, I want to live on my own. End of the day, they might find that it's a bit lonely and they're happy to share with someone, but they're not necessarily going to want to share with two others. So, but if they've got visitors, family coming over to visit, they don't want to sit in the living room with their flatmate having this private conversation. There's nowhere else for them to go. So that is why it is so important to have a second living space or multi-purpose room in a property like this. Additionally, there's no storage space. We know that especially someone who's got high physical support funding probably has, a bit of equipment. They might have a couple or even more wheelchairs. They might need them to be put somewhere to be put on charge. If it's an electric wheelchair, they need space, storage space, and extra space for these things. And those sorts of concepts were not considered in the design guidelines. So we've learned over time what makes a good floor plan. This is unfortunately not. But this is now a villa pack, as Minh was describing. You've got a 2-car garage or carport up front, the OOA room up there, and 4 single bedroom villas. So they've all got their own access. They have their own living space. They've even got a little study in there. So it could almost be considered a second little bedroom. But generally, this is a nice design. The next plan, this is a 2-bedroom plus OOA house. Now, whilst it doesn't have a second living room, it does have significantly larger bedrooms. This is from a builder in Perth that's created these.
We helped design this with the builder, and as you can see here, it's the extra large.
So it's a extra large dwelling.
Yeah.
And those really big bedrooms, I think
No, and actually,
4.2 by 6.
Debbie, it's extra large bedrooms, not extra large dwelling. No, so this is really maximizing
Well,
the space. Yeah, space
yeah,
internally.
yeah, that's what I meant really. So big bedrooms that have their own little living space. It could even have a little kitchenette in there if needed. So it is giving the idea of having more independent living space within a home. So nice design, nice concept.
And then also back to the last slide, Debbie, the courtyards were a nice addition there, having their own external space on top of the alfresco area outside that.
Yeah,
So
private courtyards. So this is just the last floor plan we wanted to show you for some concepts. This is a dual key, dual occupancy type design. So you can see we've got the porch that comes in and the garage, a hallway, and this is the main dwelling. So if I run my cursor around there, you can see what I'm talking about. 2-bedroom plus OOA, 1 living area, nice open design. This is the second dwelling. You got the porch to come in here. It's just a 1-bedroom with a combined living kitchen dining area. So you've got the OOA is right next door to this dwelling and of course is in this dwelling. So you've actually got the ability to house 3 tenants, maybe a little more successfully if you're talking about tenancy matching, that sort of thing. Than if you just had a 3-tenant house where you're very unlikely to get the third tenant in. So it's just an example of various designs. And there are drawbacks to these, there are positives to these, which is what we're going to go into when we're talking about the actual tenancy mix.
can I make a comment here, Debbie? So the great thing here with this design is it promotes independence and just a different design type that you regularly see in the marketplace. The negatives of this one is that because it's a larger build floor space, looking at probably definitely higher cost to build this. So that the average 4-bedroom home is probably 210 to 220 square meters in floor plan. This is probably 280 to 300 square meters, this one here, because it's using more space, 2 kitchens, extra alfresco porch area. So it's just more designed differently, probably 280 square meters, this one, yeah, but more cost.
Yeah.
But also the income is lower. Debbie, you want to explain the income difference between a normal house versus
Yeah, absolutely. We will be going into that more now as we're talking about the tenancy mix. But the income is highest for apartments. It's a bit lower for housing, and it's lower again for the villa, duplex, townhouse dwelling type, which means although the villas or the dual key or duplex can be a really good option, it seems logical, you're going to get better, or you may get more tenants on the site. Your income, you're actually being penalized for some reason because the income is significantly lower. And that is where we come to here. As you can see, this page is just as an example of one of our feasibility, a page from one of our feasibility reports. This is an example of a block of land. And we've looked at the different options that could be built on this house. And we've got a 2-resident house, a 3-resident house, a 3-resident high-set house, a 4-resident duplex. Oops, sorry, go back. 3 villas. This could be apartments. I'm not sure if that one is relevant in this section. A 3-resident manor home, 4-resident.
That last one there,
Yeah.
NA2XL, that's where you have a double-story house with one upstairs unit and one downstairs unit.
Okay, with separate entrances, yeah.
Yeah, with a lift between.
Yeah. So the manor home, we touched on that just before in one of the images. A manor home essentially, it looks like a house from the outside. As far as the council is concerned, it's a house, but inside are individual, fully contained apartments, 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartments, and the SDA, the NDIS, will certify and enroll them as apartments, and therefore they will be applicable to receive the highest funding. So that's really important. But it doesn't suit, it's a far more expensive construction, so it's not always worth it. But you could always add granny flats if the land site allows for it as well. Did you want to talk more about this, Minh? This is showing you, obviously, we've just done some calculations, basic example calculations on what the end net yield might be on these. Now, there's a really important thing, I guess, to understand is we have put in here our estimated gross income, and that's what we're going to get to next, talking about the tenancy mix.
There's nothing much more to add to this, really. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, and all the viewers on this webinar will get the video recorded to watch and read as their own leisure.
And the slides as well, yeah.
Yeah, but back to these gross and net yields. Look, in the marketplace, the gross yield really is the 10 to 14, 10 to 15-ish range. But the net is the true important number. The net is probably 8 to 10, 8 to 11. That's where the number is that most people are seeing that they're landing in terms of the net yield. Yeah. But this shows you the types of, products you can develop on your site, depending on your budget, and also depending on the demand, the data demand as well. Yeah.
Very important. Yeah, absolutely.
What we're seeing is very popular, in my opinion, back there is the granny flat option. So if you go back there, Debbie, a 3 or 4-bedroom house plus a granny flat at the back is a efficient, cost-effective way to achieve a good return and a flexible return, because in that house you might have 1 or 2 tenants. At the back you'll have the single tenant be an IL participant or an FA participant. If you're lucky in a high demand area, you actually end up with 3 participants in the house and a carer plus 1 at the back. So that's the best case scenario. But the SIL providers having that 2 dwelling on site, being the house and the granny flat, allows you to offer different types of care supports, being the 1 to 3 shared supports in the house and the 1 to 1 in the house,
which we'll talk about in a little bit. Yeah, so this, we've got 2 examples here. This is one for a 2-resident house, a 3-bedroom, 2+ OOA. Now, there are so many different tenancy mixes that could happen for this. And if you really wanted to look at every single potential option, this is just house funded participants. As you can see, participants with 1 to 2 house funding or 1 to 3 house funding. If you remember, that refers to someone that's been funded to live with 1 other or someone who's been funded to live with 2 others. So you could have, this is all obviously completely theoretical, but 2-resident house, you could have someone with just 1 person with just IL funding. These 2. or you could have 2 residents with a good amount of 1 to 2 funding, or with just 1 to 3 funding. Best scenario in this case would be having 2 participants with the highest possible level of funding, i.e. the 1 to 2, but which is shown in this green here. But there's many, many more potentials. Yes,
Yeah.
Minh.
By the way, if you're wondering why that scenario 18 is so high at $212,000, that's because there's a fire sprinkler in there and a high location factor. Because the average high number is probably 180-ish, 170 to 190 is the high range, but the 212 number there is because of the 2 extra elements of fire sprinklers and location factor there, like a Gosnell in Perth, southeast Gosnell, southeast Perth, yeah.
Yeah, and if you do play around with that calculator, you'll see how different those amounts can be with just a few different tweaks to the criteria. So where, this actually would go down many, many, many more lines, many more scenarios. Denise could probably tell us how many scenarios there are with this. And this is just for house funding, but you could potentially have someone looking to move into the house who has villa funding, and that will be lower than any of these amounts. So that is going to reduce the income, and that is because of the lesser of rule. We will go on to that very soon. But just, again, another example, the 3-tenant house in this case. So this is a 4-bedroom, 3-tenant house. Now we've only listed here one criteria here, that is house funding 1 to 3. Because if someone has house funding for 1 to 2, that's not going to get paid because it's more than the house is enrolled for. We'll explain that clear in a moment. But here you can see it is still a pretty good income. Maximum scenario here, the green one, $235,000 for 3 tenants with HPS funding. Again, there are many more scenarios that are possible. And I'm just talking about looking at the actual numbers. I'm not talking about what is the likely scenarios, as in participant matching. And that plays a big part in it, doesn't it, Minh?
Yeah, it does. My rule of thumb to anyone talking to me in the discussion would be, whatever the maximum will be, in this case here, it's number 10, scenario number 10 there. Divide that by half, 120,000, right? That's probably the likely income you'll end up getting as a gross figure. And that's conservative too, by the way. Yeah. So never ever assume your tenancy mix scenario is the highest possible income at all. Never assume that at all. No.
That's right. And again, this comes back to these 3 factors here. HPS, only around 20-25% of participants have HPS funding. So you're less likely to have all of your tenants with HPS funding, given that most of the houses in the country are built to high physical support standards. So they've got a bit of they're spoilt for choice, should we say. FA funding, again, a similar amount, but between the 2 funding categories, you got about 50% of all SDA funded participants would fall into those 2 categories. 40% roughly might have IL. So you're actually more likely to get maybe a mix of IL and HPS, or if you're looking at the different participants in the market who've got funding for SDA. And as I just said, doesn't take into account the care provision and how that complicates things, but this is just simply going through, looking at the numbers and looking all the different potentials. So talking a bit more now about forecasting returns. So those previous examples are examples of different income streams from different combinations, but these will vary hugely depending on location, i.e. the demand, and of course the location factor. The dwelling type, as I said, it all comes down to whether they've got house funding, villa funding, apartment funding, and what the funding of the participant is that's moving into those properties. And of course, what the SDA category is. So as said there, occupancy trends, it can be assumed that fewer participants receive funding for 2-person homes compared to 3-person homes. We know there's definitely more participants out there funded to share 1 to 3. Part of the reason is that next line, aligning with the more common 1 to 3 SIL ratio. What on earth do I mean by that? SIL funding is the funding that the participants have for their care provision, to actually pay their carers who look after them on a 24/7 basis or 8 hours a day or whatever their needs are. Most participants tend to be funded for their care at a 1 to 3 level, meaning one carer looking after 3 participants. So it doesn't always equate with what the SDA funding is. The two are approved through very different funding application processes, but they can be different or they can be more in line with each other. More participants have 1 to 3 SIL, more participants have 1 to 3 SDA. So you are less likely to get participants applying for a 2-tenant house with 2-tenant funding, essentially. Now, participants, as I said, they might be applying for a 2-tenant house, but they've got 3-tenant funding. A participant has choice and control. They can choose to apply to live in any SDA house of their choosing. It's up to the property owner to say yay or nay. They're going to accept someone who's got a much lower villa funding into an apartment, for example. That is purely up to the investor to decide whether that will be acceptable or not. But the participant still has the choice of applying for that property. Of course, that can be complicated by their care, whether that matches the care that they're being given from their SIL provider. That's a whole other bucket of worms I'm not going to go into today. But you just do need to be aware that that is one of the big challenges in getting the right funded tenants in your property. And this is where we now go into the lesser of rule, which can significantly reduce your rental income. So, Minh, do you want to speak to the lesser of rule?
Let's talk about it. So you might build a house, 4-bedroom house for a carer plus 3 participants. And the maximum income could be 60, 60, 60. So 180 grand rent income is the maximum. So 60K per room, right? So whether you get have 1 tenant only or 2 tenants or 3 tenants based upon the shared numbers, and then also the category will determine. So it's probably easy if we flip the page to the next page there. And here is the next slide, which shows you what this means here. 4-bed, 4-bath, 2-car house, 3 resident with OOA with 1 to 3 shared funding is enrolled as 180 grand for the house, 60K per room. So let's say we get 3 applicants for tenants to the house. We have an FA, fully accessible tenant on a wheelchair, but 80 grand a year for 1 to 2 funding. It's rare, but let's say he does. Then the lesser of rule is 60 versus 80, 60K. And coming along is a guy living in an apartment. He finds it too lonely living by himself. He wants to go live in a house with other people. He comes along to the SDA provider and landlord and say, hey, I have 100 grand SDA funding, 1-to-1 in an apartment in the city. I want to come out and live in the house now with other mates. The lesser of is 60 versus 100, 60K. And lastly, there's someone in a villa, very small villa, as we saw earlier, and he wants to move into a house which is big, more space, with some friends, and he's on 40K IL funding at 1 to 2. In this case, it is 40 versus 60. 40 is the winner. So it isn't 80 plus 100 plus 40. It is 60, 60 plus 40. So that's the easiest way to explain this whole, lower of rule. The lower of number is the actual outcome.
Is what's paid. Yeah. Whatever's in the participant's plan, or in the rare cases that their funding is high, like in that apartment funding situation, it's the apartment, the property's funding. But that is the rare case. Usually the participant's going to come along with lower funding than is applicable to the house, because most houses are going to be enrolled as 1 to 2, or if you've got an apartment, which has higher funding applied.
There's an exception to this scenario here, and that is, let's say the house is enrolled as a 2 resident. So you can enroll it as a 2 resident house or 3 resident house.
True.
So if you enroll it as a 2-resident house, it'll be 90 and 90. It's 180 grand max in theory, which is 90-90.
Or 90 per room.
Yeah, 90 per room, sorry. And then the 2 guys come along with 1 to 2 SDA at 80K each. It'll be the lower
80
roll for
paid.
80K. So
Yeah.
it could be higher than the 60, depending if the SDA provider enrolls it with a smaller number of residents. Correct, yes.
This is
Now-
something, sorry,
Yeah.
go on, Min.
And then if the apartment guy comes along, goes, oh, I'm living here by myself, there's no one else, then the investor goes, why can't I get my 1-to-1 funding? Well, no, it's enrolled as 1 to 3 or 1 to 2. So there's the rules.
Yeah, we're seeing a bit at the moment. There's some apartments on the market that are tenanted. And the maximum income on that apartment might be 120, 110, but the participants actually got house or villa funding. So they're only on 40, 50, 60,000, and that's what's being paid. And so it can be a drastically lower income if you, as the investor, choose to accept that participant. So do remember that the investor always has the right to refuse a tenant if their income's too low.
Debbie, you remember the apartments we saw with Hiram at Stud Road, Dandenong? Those apartments were 2-tenant apartments.
2-tenant, yeah.
So with the numbers, everyone, if 2 tenants move into the house, it's probably 120, 60 per 60, right? That's 1 to 2 apartment funding. If that was enrolled as 1 tenant, 1 resident apartment, it might be 110. So the 2-tenant outcome is slightly a bit more than the 1-tenant apartment there.
Yeah, a little. So it is very complex. You just need to look at the calculator and see how many different options there are. So this is just a bit of an overview of I guess, the complexities in combining or mixing participants in a home who've got different funding amounts. So it's really important that their support needs can be worked together. You know, you don't want to have participants living in a house, sharing a house, that have very different care requirements. That's going to make the job of the care providers far more difficult, and they're less likely to want to bring in a participant with a different kind of care requirement into a house if it's vastly different. So staffing and support models. So yeah, mixed cohorts. If you've got someone with IL, with someone with HPS funding, again, that might require the staff to have different kind of training on how to look after both of those participants. You also need to consider the participants' safety and well-being. I.e. robust participants might need different safeguards. You generally wouldn't find robust participants sharing at all, but they can in some cases do so. So it's really important to know that privacy and dignity has to be maintained for all the residents. And of course, it all has to, meet compliance within the SDA guidelines and the SDA legislation. So that is something that, I've gone backwards, that the SIL providers and the SDA providers managing the property will all be looking after. It's very hands-off for the investor, but it's really important that you do understand a little bit about what goes on in the background with the participant matching. Now, I did talk about Appendix H. This is just a very quick touch on this subject. Appendix H is actually a facility within the SDA funding that allows a participant with SDA funding to share a house with non-SDA funded tenants. Now, this is Min?
Originally, 4 years ago, we all thought that Appendix H was only for family members. That was the understanding. I guess 2 years ago, there's some slight change, and since then,
yeah, it was tweaked, and we're really understanding better now what it's about. So the actual legislation quotes, i.e. family or friends, but essentially there's certain providers and organizations out there that are really working this to have a different meaning. So it can be any non-SDA funded person, and the real only requirement here is that it's in the best interests of the SDA funded participant. So it can be their family. They can live in a house with their family. They don't have to move away from their family and share with people they don't know. They might have friends who aren't on the NDIS that they want to live with. They might want to live with another NDIS participant who doesn't have SDA funding. Appendix H can be applied. It doesn't need to be applied for separately. It's just automatically brought into the plan if it's deemed appropriate by the provider and the plan, the participant's planner. But this is, it can be significantly more income.
Just to show everyone how misunderstood this Appendix H has been, I rang one of our SDA providers I work with very closely about 3 weeks ago, and I tried to explain this to him. He did not understand the information I was giving him. He goes, no, it's all family. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it was back and forth for a whole day. He didn't realize, he didn't understand it. And then we had lunch last week, Debbie, me, you, and Grace, and the SDA provider. And I said to him, how many Appendix H's do you have? Oh, 7 or 8. Are they all family? All family. And then he mentioned the other competitor, SDA provider in Brisbane here, they have 22 or 23. They were all family as well. So there's been no understanding of this Appendix H could apply to non-family members and SIL participants who have no
And in
SDA.
fact, we didn't realise this until recently. We were at a seminar and a SIL provider mentioned it to us. Oh, we're putting in SIL participants without SDA funding and using Appendix H. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for us. So it is a way to bump up the income. So you might, as a property owner, when your property is ready for tenancy, be offered a participant with Appendix H.
Can I jump in with these numbers here in front of us? So to show everyone the impact here. Don't just think this number here on the left, SDA funding plus the extra is the answer. Well, let's use an example here. Let's use a house funded house 3 resident 1 to 3. Let's say there is one resident in there at 78,868,000. There it is. That's the total income for that house. And the other 2 rooms are empty. So carer plus HPS and empty and empty. There we are. And then one day, the SIL provider finds a friend of his who wants to live with him, right? And he's SIL participant only, no SDA, no hope of getting SDA ever, but he's willing to chip in his 30% of his MRRC. So was it 30% of that? 30% of his DSP is about 12, 13-ish grand, almost close to the MRRC. So it's about 13 grand coming in that he actually pays for.
I think it's 25% of the disability support pension.
I read in one of the articles that SIL providers don't normally pay more than 30%. So call it 25% of that thing is about 10, 11 grand there. So there's 78 plus the 11 grand he's paying from his own pension, right? As a income as a tenant, plus the Appendix H here. So over here, Debbie, we're looking at 43, is that right? Is that how this works? Sorry, I can't hear you, Debbie.
Sorry about that. I muted myself. Yeah, so the extra is going to be almost 44,000 for a total of 122 income. So essentially that is there to compensate the property owner for not having a second tenant.
Plus that 11 grand extra.
Yeah.
So 133 grand income in this scenario I'm giving you an example of the tenant, SDA tenant, the SIL participant, their income that they're paying, plus the Appendix H as well. As long as that is in the best interest of the SDA participant to begin with. So
absolutely.
And that may be he's lived by himself in a big house, he's lonely, he's bored, he's just depressed, and he'd like to have a flatmate who's a friend of his living with him, and that's in his best interest right there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so just be aware that that is also an interesting funding option, that whilst your scenario might end up not being as good as you would hope, an Appendix H situation can be of benefit. So really that actually covers everything we were going to talk about today. I just want to add a couple of things just in general. If you have any interest in the SIL world, we are going to be speaking, Minh and I, at the National SIL Summit, which is going to be on the Gold Coast at the end of September. Please do sign up for that and come along if that might be of interest to you. So predominantly for SIL providers, but it will be a couple of hundred people, I believe, going along, 2 days, of some fantastic speakers from all over the country talking about SIL and how that relates to SDA in some sessions, but also just in general the complexities of the SIL world, because it is so important to understand that and how it impacts SDA. Minh?
All good. Next slide.
And the last thing we wanted to share was, if you do want any more information, we've listed a few of our podcast episodes that sort of have a bit of relevance to what we've covered today. If you use that QR code, that will take you straight to the podcast on Spotify, but it is available on all main podcast hosting networks. Also, if you're more interested in getting a report, we have some standard reports. We can also do bespoke reports. If there's something specific you're after, talk to us, and we should be able to help you out. So that is it for today. Now, I think there's been a couple of questions that have come up. Denise has been answering them, but and just before we go into that, just do please, if you have any questions further to this that you want to get in touch with us, you can give us a call, 1300 254 397. Our email address is info@ndis.property. Remember, you will be getting a copy of the presentation today, the video, as well as a copy of the actual slides. But let's
cover these two questions so far.
Yeah.
And folks, feel free to throw your questions into the chat box right now while we're going through it all. There's a question here, Debbie, asked by, I think it's Pauline, I think. What happens if you have different SIL providers to different participants in the same house, I assume? Who's responsible for the power internet when there's only 1 meter?
Good question. It is, yeah. It is rare to get two different SIL providers working in the same house. We would like to see more of this collaboration happening, because that would allow more properties to get a better tenancy outcome. As for the power and the internet, yeah, that is complicated. That is going to be something that the SDA provider will need to negotiate with the different SIL providers working in the property. Minh, did you have something to add to that?
I reckon it's pretty shared 1/2 or 1/3. That's all it will be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Next question was asked by James. He's asked, where's the best place to look for supply and demand trends? So Debbie, where are the raw data? Where is that published on?
The raw data is available on the NDIS website. It's a little bit tricky to find it. You do have to sort of dig down into their data sets, I think they call it.
But that actually show trends, do they?
They don't show trends, no.
No.
You only get the latest quarterly data. It's updated every 3 months. We actually have a report since we started keeping those reports, those spreadsheets that we've created, called SDA Trends. So you can download that for free off our website. It's a free ebook that we update every quarter. It is quite broad, however. It will only give you that information based on the SA4, which is that same general broad area that I was discussing earlier when it was talking about the location factors in the calculator. So we do have the trends, supply and demand data. We also have over and under supply, and we also have just the supply and demand data. And those are 3 ebooks that we produce and update every 3 months. So please do feel free to go onto our website and download them.
Can we drag Denise back in for a question or two so I'm going to ask her? Denise, are you there?
Yes.
Hello, Denise. It's not fair that we do all the talking, right, Debbie? And she says nothing. Denise, did we miss anything at all in our presentation today regarding the feasibility stuff? Is there anything missing that we should cover? Do you explain?
I think all is good, but I would just like to note that the tenancy mixes presented in our feasibility reports do not account for SDA funding types outside of each option's enrolled building category. So this means our predicted net yield may potentially differ from the actual outcomes if you're unable to secure participants with the appropriate funding. But participants may be able to reapply for higher funding levels depending on their support needs and
And that's something
living
we did
situation.
not mention. Absolutely. So a participant isn't locked into the funding that they've been approved for. They can always apply for a change of circumstances to get their funding increased in line with where they are living or where they wish to live. So we see this a lot in the apartment model, where they come into the apartment with house funding, as an example, and then they go through the process of applying to have their funding increased to apartment funding. And as long as the support team behind them sort of know what they're doing in terms of writing the reports and proving to the NDIS why it is reasonable and necessary that their funding is increased, it is likely to be approved, especially if it's an area where there is, great example, Sydney, there is a lot of apartments. There's not a lot of house stock or villa stock. Just because of the cost of land and development makes it less feasible. So more apartments are in the market, and a participant wants to live in a particular location because that's where they've always lived. That's where their parents are, their social network, their supports. But there's only apartments. So that's a really good reason for them to apply to have their funding increased to apartment level, because it's the only appropriate housing available to them.
Or you might be living in a group home in Box Hill, Melbourne, with 5, 6 other people, and then you're already funded for 20 grand a year. But then you find out that the government's phasing out the funding for a group home. So they go, I want to live in a 3-resident house up the road in Box Hill, Melbourne. And then they apply for a change of circumstances to go from SDA 20K to SDA 50K, 60K. So that should take about 2 months or so to get approved and processed, because that's from a person who already has SDA funding. A slight bump up. But if you have no SDA funding to apply to get SDA funding for the first time, that might take 6 to 9 months right there as a process to apply for it. Yeah.
I've just seen a question pop up, Mary. You can't seem to download the ebooks. I'll just actually, again, share my screen and show you where they are. You will need to put in your contact details if you're downloading them off the website. But here we are. If you go to ebooks, resources ebooks, there's the design ebooks. So here we go. Here's the supply and demand ebooks. Click on download. That's simple. So if you do have any problems, though, do reach out to us. Just send us an email and we'll send it straight through to you. No problem whatsoever.
Are there any more questions from anyone else sitting in the room while to watch this ending here? It must have been death by PowerPoint today, Debbie.
Or we answered all of your questions.
Look, I guess it is complex working on the feasibility and the tenancy mixes. It is. Denise, how long does it take if someone says, hey, I want to pay for a report for a tenancy mix? How long will that take to do versus a full feasibility on my site, which could be any one of those options, A, B, C, D, E, F, G kind of thing? Can you explain to us the time frame it takes to do all that?
Sorry. Well, for a quick visibility on a already enrolled type of SDA, we could maybe take just a week to get it done. But if it's a full, as was shown in the slides earlier, with like maybe 6 to 10 building options, that could go between maybe 3 to 5 weeks ish. Yeah.
I think it's important for investors to know what the end result will be before we spend $800,000 to $1 million. Just, you don't want to be told from Facebook or some guy, oh, you're going to make 280 grand, 250 grand, 220 grand a year rent because there's people lining up. We had a discussion yesterday. Didn't we? Did you say about someone saying, yeah, plenty of participants lined up there waiting for the house? Yeah, like people, the research is very important, right? As you can see from our webinar today, we're very conservative in our approach and our expectations of the result here, because to build a house or develop a property, it takes a year and a half. A year. A lot can happen in that 1 year time frame, Debbie. Do you want to explain that?
So much happens in this industry on a weekly basis. At the moment where we're at in this maturing SDA property industry, we have a huge amount. As if you go back to those initial slides, if you remember from Barwon, and we showed the numbers that were enrolled properties, and then we showed the numbers that were pipeline. That pipeline, what that means is any property that has had its plans certified as SDA compliant, that is submitted to the NDIS before they start construction. All of those submissions are then collated by the NDIS in their data, in their quarterly data. And that is what the pipeline is. 16 odd thousand, I think it was, something like that number. At the moment, for this latest quarterly data that came out month and a half ago, that is a lot of properties or places. So the thing is, we don't know exactly if all of those places are going to eventuate. Those are just plans. Someone might change their mind at the end and say, oh, I'm not actually going to go through with this now. It looks like there's too much supply in the area. I'm not going to proceed with the build, or for whatever reason. But we would estimate that a lot of that pipeline will eventuate into SDA at the end of the day. So that is going to have a huge impact. And we've seen those pipeline numbers grow massively over the last couple of years. So it's so important to get more in-depth data. And in fact, now if you're going to be getting funding for an investment through the main lender in the space, they will require you to actually get a due diligence report, which is essentially the data. You know, the confidence that there is a demand in the area.
There's a question from Nick. What is the best way to go about finding participants?
Very good question, Nick. So traditionally, you would be relying on your SDA provider. Now, just to clarify, you must have an SDA provider because that's the only organization, the registered NDIS provider, who can enroll a property with the NDIS, and they're the only organization that can claim the funding, the SDA funds that will ultimately come to the investor. Traditionally, they would have been the organization responsible for providing or for sourcing tenants with their contacts within the SIL industry and the support coordinators and whatnot. We know that SDA providers do struggle just because it is very difficult to find tenants. So there are other organizations out there that will offer tenant procurement services. As an investor, you could do it yourself. You could actually start reaching out to NDIS providers who offer care or support coordinators. But it is a very difficult, complex, crunching the numbers kind of, when I mean by that, I mean like literally going through one after the other of hundreds of providers in the area to find that needle in a haystack of a provider that's got a potential tenant. We do have a service called the SDA Housing Assist that does offer tenancy procurement, kind of as a backup to the SDA provider. So if you did want to talk to our housing team, we'd be very happy to put you in touch with them.
So after all this, I mean, it's taken us a long time ourselves, maybe a few years, to understand the complexities of tenancy matching, tenancy mixes, the yields. I mean, I don't think I've come across anyone else out there in Australia doing these complex calculations and spreadsheets that we do. And we've evolved the last few years to dig more and understand it, because you can't just rely upon that essay calculator to assume 60 times 3 is the answer, 180 grand. It doesn't work like that, because you know, there's one thing for a calculator to tell us a number. There's another thing for the NDIA to actually give approval for SDA funding. That's number 2. And the third thing is financial viability of running a SIL business in the SDA house. Debbie, you want to give 1-2 minute summary of what we're coming across these days with regards to SIL survival and financial survival? Sorry.
SIL providers are really struggling because the SIL funding that is allocated to the participants and the hourly rate they can charge, all of those things are, they find it really difficult to make ends meet. More often than not, a SIL provider, if they're looking after NDIS participants in a home, be they SDA funded participants or not, in an SDA property or not, are generally faced with only having one tenant in the home. Again, that comes down to the complications of compatibility, tenant matching, of providers simply struggling to find clients. But at the end of the day, it's not viable for them to look after one participant in a home, because the participants most likely funded to share their supports with two others on a 1-to-3 basis. And at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. All the providers are really struggling to make ends meet with their limited number and limited pool of clients.
Speaking of pool of clients, I want to explain to you all the number of participants here. In the NDIS, how many participants are in the NDIS, Debbie?
717,000 roughly, maybe 720 now.
720, call it 720 round number, right? And how many registered providers are there?
About 20,000.
And how many unregistered providers there?
About 300,000.
So 320,000, 720,000, 320,000. Okay, so the ratio there of 720 divided by 320 is what? 2.
Roughly, yeah, 2 participants per provider.
But how many of those numbers are kids?
A lot, about 50% of all NDIS participants are children who would have funding for just foundational supports and early learning, so less relevant.
So if you remove the kids out of that,
one provider with one participant.
360,000 participants and
320,000
providers. So that's 1-to-1. Now, we know that a lot of providers have 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 or 5,000. So we know those numbers there. But on the overall scheme of things, it's 360,000 and 320,000.
The vast majority. We spoke to a provider yesterday who has actually approached us. They've not got SIL SDA funded participants, but they've got a SIL property they own. It's empty, and they want tenants. They want clients. They want us to find them clients. Yeah, so they're really struggling out there to make ends meet. So that is, part of the whole bigger picture that makes understanding the tenancy mix and the ultimate return on investment for your property really important. So I think that covers it, Minh.
Yeah, it's about time we actually cover this topic. We haven't covered it the last 2 years, but yeah, it's good to cover it.
Yeah.
If anybody wants more detailed chat with Debbie and Denise and myself for engagement to crunch your numbers on your property that you've got, or the one you're thinking about building and developing, then engage us. We'll go through all the numbers for you and present you with lots of reports to help you make an informed decision as to whether this is the path you want to take.
Yeah, every advisory client we do complete bespoke quote and look at exactly what you're needing and looking for, and individually quoted for you. So reach out to us. We'd love to speak more.
That's it then.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much for spending the lunch time today with us. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.